Hola, 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 hola. Can you speak to check if...
Hello, hello. Does it work?
Hola, 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 hola. Hola, 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 hola. 1, 2, 3, probando. Hola, hola. Ahora sí, se oye.
Cuando quieras, Martín.
Hola, hola. Prueba de cabina, traducción 1.
Hola, hola. Vale. Vale. Vamos a ir empezando en breve. Vale. Únicamente una pequeña... una pequeña cuestión técnica. La sesión que vamos a empezar ahora en breves momentos va a ser de Aaron Benanav y la va a realizar en inglés. Para tener traducción simultánea lo podéis conectaros tanto en el canal de Telegram que se ha reenviado por el canal de Telegram de la Universidad de Verano, y quienes no tengáis o cascos o móvil, tenéis unas radios que se cogen ahí al final de la carpa y os podréis conectar a la traducción simultánea. Ya tenemos. Ok. Ah, vale, esto ya está. Vale, perdón. Vale, la frecuencia, quienes hayáis cogido radios, en caso de que no esté sintonizada, debería estar sintonizada, pero es la 102.2. Y eso, también lo podéis conectaros en el canal de Telegram. Pero quienes no tengáis, podéis ir cogiendo en el final de la carpa las radios. Vale. Vale, pues vamos a ir empezando ya la sesión. Vamos a realizar primero unos pequeños apuntes técnicos. Repito lo mismo de antes, la sesión será en inglés. Tenéis el canal de Telegram de traducciones, si no están las radios ahí al final de la carpa con el 102.2 sincronizado. Y luego como dos pequeños apuntes técnicos sobre un par de cuestiones. En primer lugar, es que hoy a las 10:15 habrá una pequeña quedada a las 10 como digo, a las 10:15 en la plaza para que aquellas personas que queráis conocer el proyecto de Anticapitalistas, cuáles son las ideas centrales y cómo nos organizamos. Y luego también, como para aquellas personas que hayáis traído coche y os vayáis a ir el domingo, se ha pasado también por el canal de Telegram un pequeño formulario. Si tenéis plazas libres y podéis compartirlas para desplazar a algunas de las personas que no tienen coche a Segovia o a otros lugares, está tanto en el canal de Telegram el formulario digital, como hay algunos tablones físicos. Y eso, como si os instamos a compartir esa solidaridad de viajes. Hay casi 100 personas que lo necesitan para salir de aquí el domingo, así que aquellas personas que tengáis un huequito, os agradeceríamos que podáis hacernos un poco ese favor. Y ya pasando como de los apuntes técnicos, paso a presentar la sesión de hoy. La sesión de hoy, que está titulada como esa larga recesión del capitalismo, le estará impartida por la larga crisis del capitalismo, estará impartida por Benanav, que, bueno, si bien ayer en la sesión de tarde teníamos una sesión que fue muy interesante, titulada Transformar la crisis capitalista en crisis política, hoy queremos un poco centrarnos concretamente en qué es eso de la crisis capitalista, y seguramente no hay mejor persona en este momento que Benanav para introducirnos a estas cuestiones. Benanav es historiador, sociólogo, teórico económico, y ha trabajado en diferentes ámbitos que van desde la automatización y el futuro de trabajo, la historia de desempleo, el subempleo, las historias de desarrollo social y económico y la teoría crítica de los sistemas económicos alternativos. Recientemente, hace unos años, publicó en 2020 su libro de la automatización y el futuro de trabajo, que está editado en castellano por Traficantes de Sueños, y lo tienen ahí arriba, y desde luego es uno de los trabajos más interesantes y más estimulantes de los últimos años, en los que un poco, bueno, pues aborda esas discusiones de si esa falta de empleo y esa falta crónica de empleo que se viene a veces a adjudicar a la introducción de avances técnicos por parte del capital y por parte del desarrollo productivo se debe de forma real a esos avances técnicos y de verdad los robots nos van a quitar el trabajo. Y bueno, su respuesta es que no, sino que esas tendencias de bajo empleo, de bajo crecimiento y de baja inversión hunden sus raíces en tendencias económicas de larga crisis capitalista que se viene desarrollando durante las últimas décadas, desde el final de los 70, y un poco, bueno, pues retomando algunas de los desarrollos marxistas más interesantes de las últimas décadas, como el de Robert Brenner, del cual es discípulo directo, también de Perry Anderson es discípulo directo, y también, bueno, pues recientemente también está trabajando con bastante esfuerzo en el desarrollo de una nueva investigación y un nuevo libro sobre la historia de la planificación económica, de la planificación democrática de economía, tanto sus discusiones teóricas desde inicios del siglo XX, el presente de la planificación económica dentro de las corporaciones capitalistas en la actualidad, como el futuro de las alternativas emancipadoras y el rescate de la planificación económica como una vía de reconstrucción de ese proyecto político de izquierdas anticapitalista y marxista. Y bueno, como decimos, junto a su primer libro, y bastante exitoso, ya traducido a 10 idiomas, también ha participado recientemente en el debate de la New Left Review en torno al capitalismo político, digamos, lo que aquí se ha editado también por Traficantes de Sueños, como el nuevo debate Brenner, en el que, bueno, abordan especialmente desde la izquierda estadounidense, pero también en general la izquierda anglófona, diferentes discusiones bastante relevantes y con conclusiones políticas bastante significativas sobre las causas y las consecuencias del retorno a la política industrial, del retorno a la política industrial verde, si eso realmente...
And revolution. The COVID pandemic, however, abruptly ended this first major global sequence of 21st century struggle, forcing us to reorient ourselves in what appears to be a massively changed landscape. In this talk, I'm going to outline what I see as the contours of the current capitalist crisis. I will argue that labeling it a crisis of neoliberalism is misleading. While critiques of neoliberalism have rightly highlighted rising economic inequality, they have obscured a more significant issue: the slowing or even stagnation of capitalist economies today. I will explore why this stagnation is happening and examine two potential strategies that capitalists have proposed for overcoming this problem. The first is increased investments in digital technologies and, above all, artificial intelligence. The other is a capitalist-led, Keynesian-inspired green transition away from fossil fuels. I will explain why I think these two strategies are unlikely to succeed in revitalizing capitalist economies. And then, based on this analysis, I will suggest some outlines of a program of economic and social transformation for the left today. One of my arguments is that over the course of this period, 2008 to 2020, this period of revitalization of the left, we failed to critically assess the successes and failures of previous efforts to bring about socialism. We alternated between old slogans of total transformation and piecemeal proposals for political change without offering a really coherent vision of the world that we want to build. What we need now is not just a more coherent vision, but one that is truly inspiring and believable as a way out of the mess of capitalist society today. I'm going to share with you some brief visions of what I think that could look like, but first I want to situate us within the present landscape of capitalist crisis. The COVID-19 pandemic caused a major upheaval in capitalism, not just due to the shutdowns that followed from it, but even after the shutdowns had ended. By 2022, the global economy faced rising energy costs, high rates of inflation, and rising interest rates, driven primarily by COVID-era supply chain disruptions and also the war in Ukraine. At the same time, tight labor markets emerged in many places due to COVID-related deaths, disabilities, and migrations out of cities. In the United States, full employment was achieved between 2022 and 2024, and it led to the first significant wage increases for low-income workers in nearly 30 years. However, this period of economic tightness and turbulence is likely coming to an end now, with interest rate cuts in the major economies signaling a return to a period of slower economic growth, looser labor markets, and low interest rates. China's ongoing economic slowdown further threatens to leave the global economy without a real engine of growth. We appear to be in a period of what the late, great Italian Marxist Giovanni Arrighi called hegemonic chaos, marked by the war in Ukraine, the genocide in Gaza, trade wars with China, and the rise of the far right offering scapegoating solutions to real crises by targeting immigrants, Muslims, and the poor. While the chances for a second Trump presidency in the United States seem to be diminishing, the global rise of the far right continues to exacerbate social tensions. Meanwhile, the climate crisis worsens with more frequent and severe heat waves, floods, and extreme weather events. The green transition towards sustainable economies is now beginning to accelerate, and I'll discuss some of its impacts later. For now, the question I want to consider is, are we experiencing right now a crisis of neoliberalism? What do I mean by neoliberalism? For the past 45 years, this ideology called neoliberalism has reshaped economies across the world, leading to precarious working conditions, especially for young people in temporary jobs with little future, Austerity programs have reduced social services, forcing households to fend for themselves as living costs and rents rise. Governments have retreated from economic intervention, opting instead for mass privatization of state assets. Politicians push through unpopular technocratic reforms under the mantra, "there is no alternative." These reforms then resulted in rising inequality, corrupting political systems, and eroding public trust in government. Yet many households, drowning in debt and focused on survival, were less able to organize or to resist these changes. The same trends that unfolded in Europe and the United States unfolded in an even more brutal way in the global South, where IMF-led structural adjustments forced the poor to try to survive in a vast and expanding informal economy. Since the 2008 crisis, which is now already a long time ago, there have been frequent claims that neoliberalism is ending, yet it largely persists in so many ways. In reality, the idea that there was a distinct neoliberal period that will eventually conclude is misleading. While neoliberal ideology has definitely shaped the global economy since 1980, it's not the only force in play. Elements of state coordination and even planning did not disappear over the last 45 years. And Keynesianism, which is supposed to be the opposite of neoliberalism, which advocates for government interventions to stimulate economic growth, has actually persisted throughout this whole period of neoliberal transformation. Although governments have reduced many of their direct interventions into the economy, Keynesian spending to stimulate the economy and soften downturns has actually increased, especially since the late 1970s. The result has been rising levels of state debt, even in regions like the EU, which have focused so strongly on austerity. The narrative of a neoliberal era now in crisis oversimplifies history, and it reduces it to a pendulum swinging between periods of more state intervention and periods of less state intervention in the economy. A more fundamental trend that we have to understand if we want to understand what's driving changes in our time. The economy isn't just becoming more unequal today, it's also growing more and more slowly than it used to. This is a phenomenon that economists call secular stagnation. This stagnation began in the 1970s, before the neoliberal era, and it has continued throughout that period. Slowing growth in the global north has significantly impacted global south economies, which rely on exporting goods from their countries to wealthy countries in order to fund development. Stagnation in rich countries then caused lost decades of development in poorer regions, which were then made significantly worse due to these IMF-led programs of structural adjustment. Meanwhile, in part because economic growth rates have slowed down, the wealthy have been able to capture most of the gains of the growth that is taking place, while the incomes of the poor and the working class have mostly stagnated. Understanding this stagnation tendency, I think, is crucial to grasping the current economic situation, its potential futures, and what the left can offer today. So what is economic stagnation? What do I mean by that? Economic stagnation occurs basically when economic growth rates, the growth of GDP, slows down. And a key sign or a key cause of that is that companies are no longer investing in expanding their production. They're opting instead to repair existing plants, equipment, and update their software systems without really growing or expanding their operations. That's just what it means for economic growth rates to slow. We are not expanding our capacity to produce goods and services as quickly as we used to in previous eras. And that means less job creation, fewer wage increases for workers, and less tax revenue for social programs. Instead of investing in increasing production, what many companies are doing is they're holding on to their profits in the form of financial assets like stocks and bonds, or else they're distributing their profits to shareholders as dividends and stock buybacks. This shift from a world of rapid real investment to a world of financialization, where wealth is held in increasingly liquid financial forms, is both a cause and a consequence of economic stagnation. So the question is, why are companies hesitant to invest? Why do they doubt the future demand for their products? Economists began to recognize stagnation as a significant problem about 10 years ago, acknowledging that there's been this long-term slowdown in the growth of capitalist economies. And they generally offer two competing explanations. One is that this is really about technological exhaustion. Neoclassical economists suggest that opportunities for technological innovation might simply be diminishing. Since economic growth, in their view, is primarily a story of the development of new technologies, they say that if there's a slowdown in rates of economic growth, it must mean that there are just fewer new technologies available for capitalists to exploit. The second explanation focuses on global imbalances in finance and trade. So this story comes mostly from the new Keynesians. They point to global trade and financial imbalances. They say that countries like China, and to some extent Germany and the EU, are exporting far more than they import, and they're accumulating large reserves of foreign currencies instead of buying goods from the countries that they are exporting to. This global trade imbalance is seen as a major cause of underinvestment across the world, and that has also encouraged, they say, the financialization of economies. I propose a really different explanation for the economic stagnation we see today. I focus instead on this shift from a manufacturing-based economy to a services-based economy. This transition began long before the neoliberal era, but it has continued to accelerate throughout the period called neoliberal. It marks a dramatic shift within a much larger story of the history of capitalism. For the past 250 years, industrialization has been the cornerstone of capitalism's economic dynamism. During this long era of industrialization, firms found more and more ways to lower costs and raise revenues, generating virtuous cycles of economic growth. Rising productivity in these firms led to higher incomes mostly for capitalists, but also for workers. These income gains were then spent largely on buying industrial products, and that fueled industrial expansion, leading to job creation and more income growth. Workers in this period moved from low productivity activities like farming and domestic service into high productivity growth industrial jobs. And that transition further boosted output in factories and on farms, producing more and more stuff with fewer and fewer workers. In contrast, many services such as teaching, healthcare, and customer service are inherently very labor-intensive and difficult to automate. Think about how few students a teacher teaches in a lifetime compared to how many iPhones a factory worker in China assembles in their lifetime. As economies shift from agriculture and industry to services, workers often move from jobs that see high productivity growth rates to jobs with low productivity growth rates in services. Since productivity growth, meanwhile, is the major driver of economic growth, the higher our productivity is, the more we can produce with the resources we have. The transition to a services-based economy has slowed the overall growth rate of the economy and its potential for growth into the future. This next part is a little technical, but I hope you'll be able to follow, and I'm happy to answer questions about it. But one of the major consequences of slower productivity growth, slower efficiency gains in services, is that the prices of services tend to rise a lot faster than the prices of goods. So the price of healthcare and education rise a lot faster than the price of televisions and cars. That trend might encourage people to buy fewer services and more goods. But actually, despite this rising cost of services, people continue to buy more and more of them. Housing, education, healthcare, childcare, elder care, and even entertainment, these are essential items that people basically can't go without. As services consume or absorb more of people's incomes, they actually have less new income to spend on goods. And the effect of this is that it slows the growth of markets for manufactured goods. And the result of that, the key result of this constriction in the growth of demand for manufactured goods, is that it leads to persistent overproduction in industry. Factories end up producing more than they can sell. And that leads to industry consolidation, it leads to deindustrialization, and a further transition to services. In the past, in the period of industrialization, rising productivity in industry led to higher incomes, which were largely spent on goods, funding further industrial growth in this kind of beneficent cycle. Now, people are spending more of their income on services rather than goods, so the growth of markets for manufactured goods is constrained, and that leads to overproduction, deindustrialization, and further economic slowdowns. These trends have advanced furthest in the wealthiest countries in the world, but that shift has had major global implications because wealthy countries are the main markets for the exports of poorer countries. So the shift to a service-based economy in the global north then affected the global economy via these changing consumption patterns. As the demand for new manufactured goods slows in richer countries, poorer countries find it harder to find markets for their exports. And that leads to deindustrialization even in very poor countries, as I mentioned before. China, as I said, also was an exception to this trend, but even China has been deindustrializing due to this weak growth of global demand. This shift from a manufacturing to a service-based economy is one of the most profound changes happening in modern economies. And it has really significant political and social implications. Politically, this transition has coincided with the decline or shrinking of the industrial working class, which once and still today is the backbone of socialist and labor movements. The industrial working class played crucial roles in shaping the politics of the 19th and 20th centuries, advocating for labor rights, fair wages, social safety nets, and so on. And beyond those reforms, industrial workers also played a big part in leading the fight for a fundamental revolution to overturn the capitalist mode of production. As manufacturing jobs have dwindled and been replaced by service jobs, the political power of the organized working class has declined. Moreover, in this period of decline, trade unions have mostly used their more limited powers to defend their own members, ensuring security for insiders while leaving outsiders to fend for themselves in much more precarious conditions. Part of why they're able to do that is because despite the dominance of the service sector, industry remains a key driver of economic growth due to its unique ability to boost productivity through technological innovation and economies of scale. The issue is that maintaining a strong industrial base has become very challenging in this new, highly competitive environment. And it's a feat that only a few East Asian countries have really managed to achieve through dynamic industrial policies. Now, it's important to say that the economic stagnation we're experiencing is not only due to the shift from manufacturing to services. It's also closely linked to a slowdown and even reversal in rates of population growth. Whereas populations were growing in the past, they're now starting to shrink, especially in wealthy countries. During the era of industrialization, the world saw both rapid economic growth and rapid demographic expansion. From around 1 billion people in 1800, the global population has soared to nearly 8 billion people by 2020, and even more today. The rural population, which peaked at around 3.5 billion people, is still today larger than the entire global population was 2 centuries ago. Meanwhile, the urban population has exploded from around 100 to 150 million urban inhabitants in 1800. We now have 4.5 billion people living in cities today. This major demographic growth was a key factor in the proletarianization of the world's population. The constant influx of people into the labor market, especially in cities, gave employers really significant power over workers, keeping wages low and reinforcing capitalist control in the workplace. This rapid population growth has now ended in the global north and is declining rapidly across much of the global south, with the exception of some regions in Africa. Population growth was a major driver of economic growth, not just because more people meant more workers, but also because a growing population meant a greater demand for housing, for goods, and for services. Companies expected demand to grow with the population. As population growth slows or even reverses, the potential for economic growth also diminishes. This demographic shift is a major reason why companies are hesitant to invest in expanding production. They doubt that there will be enough demand in the long term to sustain that increase in their productive capacities. While a shrinking or stable population could mean less competition for jobs for young people, potentially making it harder for employers to push down wages, this won't necessarily lead to better outcomes for workers. Without rapid productivity growth, firms find it more expensive to hire workers relative to the value they produce, which could continue to limit job creation and wage increases. Meanwhile, caring for aging populations is going to impose significant social costs. Economic stagnation, driven by the shift to services and then enhanced by population reversals, has profoundly impacted corporate strategies. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, industrialization led to the rise of these massive multi-divisional corporations, starting in core industries like railroads and steel. By the mid-20th century, during the so-called golden age of capitalism, large corporations reached their peak, wielding significant social power by setting their own prices and securing stable profits in an environment of little real competition. This situation allowed them to reinvest in massive expansions, fueling sustained economic growth. In the 1970s and 80s, this landscape significantly shifted. The shift to services constrained the growth of markets for manufacturers, as I've already explained. Increasing competition from low-cost production sites in the global south, like initially Mexico and Brazil, and then later China, intensified this competitive pressure on corporations. Corporations began to lose their control over prices as competition increased. In response to this, the biggest companies adopted a new strategy. They shifted away from direct production and focused only on very high value-added activities like promoting their brands and investing in research and development. Instead of suffering from competition, they sought to benefit from it by outsourcing manufacturing to supplier firms and then playing those firms off of one another to secure lower prices. This strategy, of course, extended to labor as well. Companies sought to minimize their labor costs by playing workers off against each other in a context of generally higher rates of unemployment. This shift shouldn't be understood, as some have said, as a turn to so-called neo-feudalism, although it's true that some companies have cornered markets and are living off of rents without really investing at all. The truth is that many firms still engage in R&D. Think about a company like Apple, which is always releasing new versions of its iPhones, or the pharmaceutical industry, which has just released these new weight loss drugs. The point is that these new corporate strategies entail less investment, fewer new jobs, and slower economic growth than in the past because the leading firms don't build any new production plants. Instead, they focus on brand promotion and product development and end up holding on to a lot more of their profits or returning them to shareholders in the form of dividends and stock buybacks. So far, I've argued that to understand the crisis of the present moment, we must go beyond the framework that emphasizes the crisis of neoliberalism. The transformations of our era are the culmination of a long period of rapid growth that capitalist industrialization initiated more than 2 centuries ago. Neoliberalism wasn't really the cause, it was rather a response to these epochal shifts in capitalism. Neoliberalism was an attempt by states to help companies find a new engine of growth to sustain high productivity and economic expansion despite the shift to a services-based economy and the ongoing reversal in population growth. Governments allowed companies the freedom to experiment, often very destructively, with the environment, with labor, and communities in the hope of finding the next big economic breakthrough. However, this strategy has largely failed, as evidenced by persistent economic stagnation. The demographic aspect of this stagnation is very unlikely to reverse, but the service-based economy could become somewhat more efficient through the consolidation of the many small service providers that currently exist into larger firms. In the US, the deregulation and consolidation of sectors like finance, retail, and healthcare have allowed a few very large firms to dominate their markets, leading to some efficiency gains despite this overall tendency to stagnation. However, Europe and Japan have resisted this change. They've protected small businesses because those are crucial for the political stability of both the center-left and center-right political parties. Are there other ways out of capitalism's enduring crisis? For decades now, digital technologies were seen as the future of capitalism, expected to drive a new era of productivity and economic growth. Computers and the connectivity they enable were supposed to lead to a technological boom. However, despite increasing digitalization through past decades, economic growth has continued to slow down, a phenomenon known as the Solow paradox. As economist Robert Solow observed already in the 1980s, we see computers everywhere in our society except in the productivity statistics. Why haven't digital technologies delivered the expected economic gains? Well, digital technologies have certainly transformed manufacturing. The rise of robots and computerization has led to significant productivity gains across the industrial sector. However, these gains have slowed since the 2008 economic crisis. In contrast, the impact of digital technologies on service sector productivity has been much less dramatic. While there was a lot of talk about the coming of the robots and their potential to revolutionize industries like healthcare, education, and hospitality, this transformation did not occur on a significant scale, and really, if you look around your society, there are hardly any robots at all in services. Recently, attention has shifted to artificial intelligence, particularly machine learning. Tools like ChatGPT and other chatbots sparked excitement and a surge of investment, especially in Silicon Valley in the United States. Many investors have hoped that AI would be the breakthrough needed to ignite really broad-based economic growth in these stagnating capitalist societies. However, the reality so far has actually been pretty disappointing. AI has not proven to be the killer app that many anticipated. business applications for AI have been much more limited than expected. You may not know this from reading the news that's always talking about all the changes AI is going to bring about, but if you read the financial press, they're actually very worried about how little change these new technologies are bringing about in businesses. Even major proponents of this new technology, like Goldman Sachs, have recently significantly downgraded their expectations for AI's impact on productivity. While digital technologies have definitely significantly impacted some information-based fields, like journalism and graphic design, and may have further effects on customer service and computer programming jobs, their impact on these very large sectors of the service economy, like education, healthcare, and housing, has again been very modest. Despite these limited productivity gains, digital technologies have generated significant profits for companies in other ways. That's because digital technologies have made it possible for firms to streamline training and monitor worker performance more accurately at a much lower cost. Think about the ways that digital technologies have been deployed at Amazon warehouses to track worker productivity minute by minute. That hasn't necessarily made the work those workers do more efficient, but it has enabled Amazon and other employers to enforce stricter performance standards without having to pay workers higher wages in exchange for greater effort. In this way, digital technologies have made it possible to shift more of the income that firms produce from workers to capital, in short, increasing the rate of exploitation in the economy. This also mirrors broader globalization trends, where digital technologies have enabled companies to buy labor in low-wage labor markets, again shifting income from labor to capital and increasing income inequality. Of course, rising inequality is a really important part of the story, but I'm trying to show you how to see it within the larger story of capitalist firms' adaptation to a period of worsening global economic stagnation. Of course, the impact of digital technologies extends beyond the workplace. The proliferation of smartphones and social media have led to constant distractions and have reduced our potential for sustained focus. These technologies are intentionally designed to be addictive, exploiting primal aspects of human behavior, much like cigarettes and gambling did in earlier eras. Silicon Valley has actually studied these and adapted these addictive technologies for the digital age, leading to widespread social media addiction, increased social anxiety, disconnection, and feelings of hopelessness. This critique of the digital technologies of today, you should be sure, is not an argument against technology as such. On the contrary, technology holds enormous potential to solve our problems today, as demonstrated by the rapid development of COVID-19 vaccines just a few years ago. The issue lies in the limited transformative capacity of technology with respect to specifically capitalist imperatives, where the focus is on finding new sources of efficiency and products to sell. Capital has increasingly turned to risky, short-sighted strategies that often undermine long-term human well-being. One of the most concerning aspects of the current obsession with AI is its environmental impact. The massive investment in AI requires majorly energy-intensive data centers projected to contribute significantly to global greenhouse emissions in the coming decades. The focus on AI has also diverted attention and resources away from the real technological challenge of our time, developing green technologies to fight and adapt to climate change. While green technologies could drive a more sustainable form of capitalism, they have not received nearly the same level of investment as AI has in the United States. The question remains, could the green transition then be the key to getting capitalism out of this period of stagnation? The green transition definitely offers a potential way forward for the global economy, but it's fraught with major challenges. Initially, the idea of any kind of green transition faced major resistance from capitalists. Economists had argued that to stop climate change, we would have to raise the price of carbon, forcing companies to pay more of their real costs of production and encouraging consumers to shift away from the consumption of carbon-intensive goods to other goods. This move would have dampened the demand for many products, so companies resisted it with all of their power. In truth, this carbon pricing approach was a complete red herring. It would never have solved the problem of climate change. Fossil fuels are simply too deeply embedded in the global economy for that strategy to work. Substituting other goods and services for carbon-intensive products will never be feasible without first re-engineering the economy to offer actual alternatives. And to really transition between energy systems and create those alternatives, a complex society like ours requires massive, coordinated, and planned efforts. We're finally beginning to see some movement in this direction today. The green transition demands not just new infrastructures, but also new energy sources, grid upgrades, and investment in research and development of the sort that, in a capitalist economy, only the state can undertake. This massive investment still faces major opposition, of course, from multiple sources. First, there are the oil companies, who stand to lose a lot of the value of their investments. Behind them, there are broad sections of the capitalist class who fear that state intervention required to effect this energy transition will end up politicizing the economy and making possible much broader changes in society. At the same time, governments are hesitant to admit what they have to do because decades of neoliberalism have significantly weakened state capacities. Despite these challenges, governments in the global north and China are starting to make big, major investments, public investments in the green transition. This shift is happening faster than most people expected, partly due to the rapidly falling prices of wind and solar energy. Early skepticism about the green transition was also rooted in the belief that renewable energy would always be much more expensive and less reliable than fossil fuels. While challenges remain, especially around the need for better battery technology, as well as limits to green production of essential inputs like steel and concrete, there's significant progress being made in these fields. Compared to the often unfulfilled promises of the Silicon Valley tech revolution, green tech advances offer a much more dynamic and potentially successful path forward for capitalism. Getting there, of course, as I said, will require major state interventions, making a green version of Keynesianism increasingly relevant in the politics of our time. So, will this green transition revitalize capitalism? One big unknown is where energy prices will settle. Historically, major economic revolutions have been linked to falling energy costs. If, as I said, the green revolution leads to significantly cheaper energy prices, then what was available with coal and gas, that could be a game changer for capitalism. However, there are doubts about whether the green transition will really succeed as green Keynesians hope. A major issue is that this transition is closely tied to manufacturing. So it's subject to the same challenges that I already described earlier, namely a depressed demand for manufactured products and limited market growth in the context of this ongoing shift to services. This dynamic is already starting to affect the electric vehicle market, which is growing so much more slowly than a lot of car companies anticipated. Whatever happens, China's role in the green transition is going to be pivotal to what comes next globally. The Chinese government has, over the past few decades, made a massive push into green technologies like solar panel production, batteries, and wind power. Domestically, China is nearing a point where all of its new energy needs will be met by renewables, and the country has also made significant strides with respect to increasing the share of EVs in new car sales. Most crucially, however, Chinese firms are aggressively exporting these technologies to the rest of the world. China now produces enough solar panels to meet all global demand for solar panels. And it's rapidly expanding into many other export fields, especially car production. The company BYD, the Chinese company BYD, has earned the moniker the Tesla killer because its cars are so cheap that there's no chance that Tesla will be able to compete with them. The extent of China's head start in green production creates major problems for the green Keynesian plan. For green Keynesianism to actually stimulate economic growth effectively, state spending in one country or region, like the EU, must lead to investment and economic expansion within that area. Otherwise, state spending will result in rising state debt levels relative to GDP. Instead of stimulating the domestic economy, this spending will end up stimulating the economy elsewhere, and basically in China. That's why, as the EU and the US become more serious about the green transition, they have started engaging in major trade wars with China. These trade wars are unlikely to succeed because the US and EU still depend on all of these critical resources that China produces. Meanwhile, even if the US and EU close their markets, the rest of the world is definitely going to depend on Chinese tech for their own transitions. And surprisingly, in spite of this incredible push in the direction of green production, the Chinese economy, as I already mentioned, is still seeing a real slowdown and stagnation in its own economy. So even this major transition isn't really reversing the trend in China. All of this suggests that it will be very difficult for capitalism to generate a manufacturing revitalization through the green transition. Of course, it also goes without saying that capitalist investment in green technology is only going to focus on the most profitable aspects of the real green transition that humanity actually needs. That's going to perpetuate many unsustainable economic practices, even if it significantly lowers total carbon emissions. So, with that background, coming to my concluding section, I want to ask the question, does the left have an alternative path to offer in this context of enduring economic stagnation and persistent economic hardship? In the 2010s, as social struggles reemerged and new left parties formed, it became clear, at least to me and I think to many others, that the left lacked a real coherent program for change. Various proposals were made, of course, but they didn't seem to add up to a real unified vision. In my view, and in the view of increasingly many others, this was largely due to the failure of all of our groups to thoroughly think through the successes and failures of 20th century efforts to build socialism. And that left us unable to distinguish ourselves clearly enough from failed experiments in the USSR, which the larger public has no interest in repeating. We failed to move beyond, in many ways, this old debate, which is better, planning or markets? As scientific research drives technological advance more and more, a greater degree of planning is inevitable. Even in capitalist economies, we see this massive turn towards more and more planning, above all in the green transition. However, the complexity of modern economies means that markets will likely always play a significant role in the organization of the economy going forward. Producers and consumers need the freedom to choose among a variety of different suppliers, something that centralized planning has never really been able to achieve, whether it's guided by human bureaucracies or whether it might in the future be guided by digital algorithms. That leaves the left, I think, at a kind of impasse. We mistakenly equated markets, which have existed for millennia and can coexist with many different modes of production, with capitalism's specific feature, which is profit-led investment, or what Marx called capital accumulation. This focus on planning versus markets, I think, has distracted us from the real question. We definitely need to coordinate economic activity across many different producers and consumers using both planning and markets, but the question is, what are we coordinating all of this activity for? What's the goal that's guiding our economy? The core aspect of capitalism, of profit-led investment, is its emphasis on efficiency gains as the primary goal organizing production. Capitalist firms strive to maximize their incomes by minimizing their costs and maximizing their revenues, leading to increased efficiency in this very narrow sense. Capitalist firms are trying to extract more and more profit from every unit of investment. As we saw earlier in my presentation, that's not the only way capitalist firms make profits. They also try to get monopoly control. They use these technologies to shift shift income from labor to capital, increasing the rate of exploitation. But even when capitalist firms are working well as they're so-called supposed to, this relentless focus on efficiency still creates really significant problems. Prioritizing efficiency above all has led to environmental degradation, the destruction of communities, the reduction of workers to mere cogs in the machine. As Marx observed, the obsession with efficiency depletes the Earth's resources, and it alienates people both from their work and from each other. To counter these consequences, to turn things in a new direction, we would need to reorganize production so that it serves many different goals. These other goals, this larger set of goals, need to suffuse the process by which we provision ourselves with goods and services. Ecological sustainability is, of course, one of these goals that we need to pursue, but it's not the only one. We also need to enhance the social and economic security of everybody. We need to improve work, make work better. We also need to distribute work more equitably, reduce the amount of labor that everyone has to do each week and in their lifetimes. We need to find ways to bring communities together rather than dividing them. And we need to prioritize social justice in the organization of economies and societies, including reparations to address all of the harms caused in the past by capitalism, by sexism, and by colonialism. In a capitalist economy focused on profitability, all of these broader aspects of human happiness are sacrificed to the one overriding goal of greater efficiency. As efficiency gains get harder to achieve, the demands on workers and on society only increase. More work, more debt, more risk, and less rest. It's like trying to squeeze juice from a stone. What's particularly tragic about this situation is that capitalists have meanwhile built these highly complex enterprises, bringing together all of these workers with diverse skills and abilities to try to solve very difficult tasks, and in the process of doing so, generating this huge wealth of knowledge and potential. This is a potential that could be harnessed to produce technologies that could advance human well-being across all of these different fronts. Reorganized enterprises could figure out how to redirect our resources to ensure that everyone's needs are met, reorganizing, among other things, housing, healthcare, transportation, communication networks. They could figure out how to make production more sustainable, how to rebuild communities, and how to repair and enhance even our relationship with the environment. While these efforts might not drive significant growth in how much we can produce, they would dramatically improve human welfare across all of these different dimensions. Yet firms avoid these efforts because in a capitalist economy, those kinds of efforts would only increase the firm's costs, not its benefits, which it measures solely in terms of profit. From a human perspective, this situation is just absurd. It was always absurd to continue with capitalism, but to continue with it after the era of rapid industrialization and demographic growth has become more absurd than ever before. It only benefits rich people, and even many rich people are deeply unhappy. Like, look at Elon Musk, for example. He's having this constant public meltdown. And it causes needless suffering for the rest of the population. But to get out of this mess would require not just massive new investments in all of these different dimensions of human well-being, it would also require that we build new institutions to govern and shape investment in a more conflictual and complex way. A major flaw in leftist thinking for centuries now has been the belief that in moving beyond capitalism, we would achieve a much more harmonious society because where class antagonism is overcome, we've said, politics are supposed to come to an end. Quoting Saint Simon, Friedrich Engels famously said that the administration of things would replace the government of men in a future socialist society. I think this idea is very flawed. It's really capitalism that drives toward an apolitical or post-political society by focusing solely on efficiency. That's how it leaves so little room for debate. This ruthless focus on efficiency has required a massive buildup of state power, both to enforce the singular goal above all others and to address all of the attendant social problems that generates. By contrast, when we embrace a much broader set of goals for our economy, including but not limited to efficiency, the question of what we should do with our economy, what our goals should be, becomes so much more complex. The best course of action from the perspective of any one goal, whether it's efficiency or sustainability or social security or work quality or community cohesion, will not align with the best course of action from the perspective of any other goal. We're going to face these important trade-offs. We're going to make these decisions that have no purely technical solution, and that will lead us towards very different worlds, very different futures. A related challenge is that the goals we need to pursue as a society are going to be interpreted very differently by different people, and can, in any case, be achieved in many different ways. People won't even agree what our goals should be. They're going to have all these debates and discussions about what our goals are. Think about the fight of people to, reduce meat consumption, for example, right? This is a goal that in the future, might become more and more important to people in the economy. And this means that when it comes to organizing the transformation of the economy over time, a socialist future will be much more open and flexible than the capitalist future has been. There will need to be more space for politics, for open-ended decision-making, in a context in which people try their best to convince each other what they think is right for our future. We'll have to build institutions where people, as workers, as consumers, and as community members, can make decisions for themselves about what the future they want will look like in a way that's both efficient and effective. And I think we've so far done a bad job of imagining what those institutions might look like. Now, some of the changes we need to make to get to a better future can begin now without having to first exit from the capitalist mode of production. Like some radical Keynesians, we might advocate and are advocating for massive investments in green transitions, rebuilding and reinvesting in education, in healthcare systems, in public transportation, and community revitalization. And of course, we also need major investments in to renew and transform the pension system and elder care in an aging population. However, unlike radical Keynesians, we don't believe that even these modest goals will be achieved without a really significant increase in social struggles and a much greater renewal of our political organizations. There's no neat trick like the modern monetary theorists propose for wresting control over the future from the capitalist class. Furthermore, social movements and political activists in our times and in the future will not be satisfied with advances in any of these areas if they are expected, once their battles have been won, to retreat back into private life and let politicians and technocratic administrators decide how everything will actually unfold. People rightly reject these proposed technocratic solutions to their problems. They want to be involved in the decisions that directly affect them. And they will need to be involved if we are going to maintain the level of activation, attention, and coherence of action that real social change demands. That brings us back to the crucial question: what institutions can we build to give workers and communities greater political control over these decisions, and especially these investment decisions, that will shape their lives in a way that really allows their broad concerns beyond just efficiency to enter into and reshape production, and so also our futures. Of course, increasing public investment and trying to find a place for people to be more involved in how that investment unfolds won't suffice to get to our goal of actually building a better future. We're going to need to abolish private property and the means of production. We're going to have to completely tear out and replace the financial system, which currently organizes, which capitalists use to organize investment in the future, with a completely different system for organizing investment and getting to the future one that is thoroughly public and political, and that has nothing to do with profit and making money. We're going to need to free people from working in firms. We are going to need to free people from working in firms and enterprises from the constraints of profit-driven investment, enabling them to use their organizational resources to address the immense challenges that we still face as a society. Again, this will require huge changes in the mode of production that will only achieve with massive social struggles, requiring major new renewal of organizations and building of their activities. And while I won't delve into the specifics here, this idea of building these new institutions, that's the focus of my next book, the sequel to this Automation and the Future of Work book that has already appeared. So I'm just going to give you, I've just given you here like a very broad sense of the direction I think we need to pursue. Sorry I went on a little longer than I said. I hope I spoke slowly and clearly enough in English for you to follow. Thanks for listening, and I'm excited to hear your comments and questions.
Vale, pues bueno, desde luego muchísimas gracias, Aaron, por tu charla. Tenemos un poco de tiempo para algunas preguntas, así que creo que el compañero puede acercar el micro. Si queréis hacer la pregunta, levantáis la mano y vemos también un poco las personas que están interesadas. Podéis hacer la pregunta en castellano, desde luego. Aquí justo delante hay Micael. Oh. Un segundo. Vale. Ok. Vale, Micael, cuando quieras. No.
¿Se me oye?
Ahora.
Sí, ¿no? Vale. Una pregunta ingenua, quizás. ¿Podría una serie de guerras, ¿podría una serie de guerras revertir la tendencia secular al estancamiento, como en su momento la Guerra Mundial pues, permitió un ciclo de expansión capitalista jamás visto hasta el momento?
Vale, muchas gracias. ¿Alguna pregunta más? Ahí.
Muchas gracias, muy interesante. Has sido crítico con la renta básica universal en tu libro como medida que podría reforzar la situación de estancamiento en vez de invertirla y tal, ¿no? Entonces, no sé qué pensarías, por ejemplo, respecto a las luchas que sí se están extendiendo internacionalmente en torno a la reducción de la jornada laboral, la semana de 4 días, etcétera. Si piensas que en la situación de estancamiento podría tener potencialidades interesantes. Gracias.
Si os cogemos alguna más si hay por ahí, quizá, y... Aquí.
Muchas gracias por la charla. Me preguntaba si, porque no lo has mencionado, pero el rol del Big Data y si eso, porque es una fuente de revenue, no me sale la palabra en español, pero al mismo tiempo también no implica un trabajo, o sea, es un trabajo que hacemos los propios consumidores, siendo consumidores productores, y si eso entra de algún modo en la lectura que haces de cómo está progresando el capitalismo, incluyendo el tema de servicios, ¿no? Porque es a través de los propios servicios de online donde creamos el Big Data que después se utiliza para vendernos más servicios. Ya está.
Vale. Creo que había una persona aquí.
quería preguntar si podrías decir un poco más sobre tu tesis contra el tecnofeudalismo, o sea, especialmente desde el punto de vista europeo, porque esencialmente, según lo que yo he entendido, si hay mucha resistencia, por ejemplo, a las grandes empresas de tecnología de Estados Unidos, de China, en Europa, cierto que esas empresas pueden dejar de hacer comercio acá. Entonces, la posibilidad de ser rebeldes frente a estas empresas acá es mucho más limitado. Y si ese es el caso, pero no es el tecnofeudalismo, ¿cómo podemos en Europa hacer resistencia a esta expansión capitalista desde el punto de vista de la tecnología?
Vale, pues si os parece te dejamos paso.
Okay. These are all really great. Oh. Sorry, I don't want to hear myself in Spanish. These are all really great questions. I'll just go through them one at a time. So, could a series of wars change the dynamics I'm talking about? Yeah, definitely it could. And one very unexpected result for a lot of European analysts is that the war in Ukraine has really benefited the Russian economy in some ways, because basically it's just this huge government spending, right? That they haven't really sold less oil, but you have all of this public spending that just buoys the economy in spite of all of these sanctions. So, would a world war, have a similar effect? Well, world war wouldn't, because it would be so destructive of the economy that, it would cause a major decline in human possibilities. I think that if there were such a war, and if humanity survived, I don't know if they would survive such a war as they did in the early 40s, but if they did, I think we would really come back quickly to where we are today, because it wouldn't change the big trend of the switch from industry to services. The way it could change things is only insofar, I think one thing that, especially in America, at times they've tried to do, is something more like military Keynesianism. A lot of military spending, but without the big wars that kill a lot of your population. That's what I think a lot of societies, insofar as they turn to military technologies, are trying to do. Just have more spending on the military, but try to avoid the big wars. Of course, in this context of, as I mentioned, this Aregian hegemonic chaos, I'm not sure that we're going to be able to prevent wars. And if you look at what's going on right now, not just the genocide in Gaza, but the way that Israel is trying to provoke and expand it into a broader Middle East war that could draw the US in, as well as other countries. I mean, there's never been a more dangerous time, in a way, for capitalist economies, at least in many decades. What about so in my book, Automation: The Future of Work, I was very critical of proposals for a universal basic income. I always say, though, when I present on it, I was very critical of the idea of universal basic income as a silver bullet, as the single strategy that could fix all the problems in our society. And one of the big reasons for that is that basic income focuses on separating workers' income from wages, but it doesn't really seek to affect or disrupt capitalist control over investment, right? So it changes the way that average everyday people get their incomes, but doesn't change the way that firms work and that capitalist economies are fundamentally oriented. So it leaves control over everything in the hands of firms, and I think that would continue to provoke this stagnation trend. But the question was, what about work time reduction? Because one big move that we see today is for a 4-day week, right? For a reduction to maybe a 30 or 32-hour work week. And I am just super in favor of this proposal for many reasons. The biggest one is that I think it would really make people happier. It would just be good for people to work less. Work is generally exhausting. It's become so much more intense. People are just burnt out, and working less would be good for people. It's one of those goals that we should be pursuing beyond anything to do with a capitalist economy. Would it reverse stagnation? No. It would just, it would improve workers' bargaining power, making labor more expensive, and as a result, firms would see their costs grow, they would see their profits reduced, and unless there are some technologies not being exploited that could account for that and make these firms much more productive, it would just result in the same situation that we have now, but with the advantage that people would have more free time, they might have more time and energy to organize politically to overthrow the capitalist system, and so for that reason, I think it's a very important struggle. The last two questions were very related. One was about big data. We're generating all of this data online through our activities. And it's this data that Amazon uses, to grow its revenue, that Facebook and Google use to sell advertising. This is definitely a big part of what's going on, but I think it's really benefited those firms at the expense of other firms. Basically, a lot of television and newspapers used to make a lot of their money through advertising. Technology companies have managed to draw a lot of that revenue towards themselves. Actually, Amazon also makes a lot of money from digital advertising. They've drawn a lot of money towards themselves, and they basically don't share it with anyone else. So it's been mostly about redistributing profit within capitalism, I think. The truth is that as society, especially the United States, become more unequal, all these firms are really just chasing the income growth of very high income consumers. Like the top 20% of consumers, the richest 20% of consumers represent more and more of the total income, the new income that's available in society. So these companies are just fighting over, this very small section, the attention of this very small section of the population. And the next question, which was related, was about techno-feudalism. It's definitely true that, these tech firms have been allowed to develop monopolies to an extent that just hasn't been possible, since the 1950s and 60s. It's just ridiculous how uncompetitive and how exploitative they have been. And honestly, to me, and I think to many observers, it's kind of insane that Europe just allowed American firms to just enter the European space and take over search, social media, like distribution, all of these functions. In China, where you have this much more realistic and also obviously much more authoritarian form of economic governance, they said there's no way we're letting these firms operate in our country. We're just going to develop our own giants, right? And now Europe is left in the situation where they're trying to regulate these companies that everyone in the entire, 500 million people use every day, that are all located overseas and that repatriate so many of their profits into tax havens. So of course, European countries should fight to, as the American government is starting to realize they should fight to break up these gigantic firms. And if those firms threaten to leave, then European countries should just say, well, we're going to build our own public alternatives to these programs. There's no reason, there's no reason to respect their copyrights, all this kind of stuff. They should just push forward. Obviously, that's a reform strategy for European capitalism. Would it make a big difference to the overall story I'm telling? I don't really think so. And just to emphasize, my main problem with the techno-feudalism thesis is it just really makes it sound like there's no dynamism anymore anywhere in the economy. But actually, there is dynamism in many parts of the economy. It's just not dynamism that's leading to these patterns of rapid expansion of production and growing jobs and growing economy in the way that it used to. So anyway, I'm happy to talk about that more for those who are interested. Was that it?
Quizá nos da tiempo a una, dos preguntas si son cortitas.
Oh.
Aquí. Vale.
¿Había una pregunta? No, perdón. Sí, a la luz del análisis que se ha preparado, que ha hecho usted, ¿qué aconsejaría a los luchadores por los refugiados inmigrantes? ¿Qué estrategia y qué tácticas serían aconsejables para trabajar en esa línea?
¿Alguien más?
Si no, lo podemos dejar con esta, pensando hacia adelante.
Well, I guess everyone just agreed with what I said. That's great. What strategies, should workers pursue? I think that if you want to know what strategies workers should pursue, you should listen to people engaged in industrial organizing on the ground. That I'm trying to provide like a big overview of where we are and where we could go. And I don't think that I'm the best person to turn to for specific strategies. Obviously, we need to do things that both organize much larger sections of the working class and also transform existing working class institutions so that they're much more combative and assertive. We're starting to see that happening in a number of places. And where I'm from in the United States, there have been this group, Labor Notes, has really influenced the new leadership of the UAW, the Auto Workers Union, which weirdly also includes all of the graduate students at universities and all these other groups too. But the UAW has taken this much more combative orientation. It's been very inspiring to people. So has, of course, the Amazon unions, the Starbucks unions, although they're on much smaller levels. But there's this real excitement about labor organizing. I would say that the thing that I'm proposing, the thing that would be in addition to all the strategies that people are already trying to pursue, is really to try to create conditions in which workers, but also community members, have much more control over the investment decisions that firms are making, to basically fight for veto power for workers and community members with respect to the investment decisions of firms. There was a little bit of movement in that direction in the 1970s among some radical trade unions, especially in Sweden and Germany and other countries, to get workers to have more control over investment decisions of firms. The fact that those strategies failed were what allowed firms to engage in globalization, offshoring, all of these strategies to suppress workers, not only in those countries, but also around the world. So it's not until we gain this real power to, decide, to do stop and go over capitalist investment, and also fight for a lot more public investment, also with a greater degree of worker and community control. That would be the first step to, in my view, getting from a world where we're fighting and resisting capitalist imposition to actually starting to break capitalist control over our future and really starting to reclaim that for a democratic socialist transition. Of course, even that kind of veto power wouldn't be enough, right? That would just be the start of a change that I would propose. But again, I really emphasize that if you want to know what strategies to pursue, talk to the people leading those efforts on the ground today, because they know a lot more than I do as a kind of, Marxist theorist and activist. So thank you so much for coming.
Bueno, pues creo que es una forma excelente que acabar y nada, eso, solamente recordar las dos cosas del inicio, el tema de los coches, si alguien tenéis hueco para el domingo, el formulario, y si queréis saber más sobre Anticapi, a las 10:15, ahí en la plaza. Y eso, muchísimas gracias.
Y devolved las radios, por favor. Devolved todas las radios.
I'm sorry, I talked